President Trump prepares for a historic meeting with Vladimir Putin over the war in Ukraine. We have the latest on President Trump's fight against DC crime and some of the surprising groups organizing and funding protests against it. Also, the Texas Democrats are preparing to head home to admit defeat on their fight against redistricting. All of that and so much more today on 10 Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Tomorrow, President Trump will meet with Vladimir Putin in Alaska to discuss the war in Ukraine. Yesterday, he held a press conference at the Kennedy Center where he talked about some of the stakes.
Will Russia face any consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to stop the war after your meeting on Friday?
Yes, they will. Yeah.
What will the consequences
There will be consequences.
Sanctions, tariffs?
There will be, I don't have to say, there will be very severe consequences, yes.
He's also working to balance expectations with Europe and Ukraine about what Ukraine might have to be willing to give up to get peace. But as Ukraine is not a part of this initial summit, President Trump has reassured both Ukraine and European leaders that any discussion about territorial disputes will be settled with Ukraine at the table. Here's a quick look at this state of play so far right now in Ukraine. As you can see over to the east, the areas that Russia has advanced since 2022, but also areas that Russia occupied before 2022, including Crimea. What the discussions right now are leading to is, will Ukraine need to give up any of that, or can President Trump exert enough pressure to get Russia to actually retreat out of some of those areas under the threat of sanctions and other penalties? President Trump has tried to play diplomat and even given Russia a lot of room to potentially negotiate, because his North Star throughout this conflict has been, how do we stop bloodshed and death the fastest? But here's one anecdote that he shared about how Putin has worked with him.
I'd get home, I'd say, First Lady, I had the most wonderful talk with Vladimir. I think we're finished. And then I'll turn on the television, or she'll say to me one time, wow, that's strange because they just bombed a nursing home.
Experts suggest that Putin has mishandled this terribly, giving President Trump every reason to not trust him as a good faith partner. And President Trump goes into this summit with major sanctions that could cripple Russia, hanging in the balance depending on how this meeting goes and depending on how willing President Putin is to talk about peace. As President Trump heads to Alaska to meet with Putin, he has the approval rating wins at his sails. Morning Consult shows that he is up 2 dealing with immigration, up 3 on dealing with the economy. Meanwhile, Gallup is the latest pollster to show Democrats at all-time lows in approval rating. We can't imagine why. As we talk about Democrats' struggles with their approval rating, we move to this discussion of President Trump trying to take on DC crime and the crazy Democrat reaction to it. One theme of the Democrat reaction to this has been protesting by making noise. Starting tonight, get loud. Silence is compliance, so we need to get loud. Starting tonight and every night of this occupation, go outside at 8 p.m. and bang pots and pans, sing, chant, or make noise for 5 minutes. I'm not sure if that's going to have the effect that they are looking for, but Democrats are trying to do everything they possibly can to show that they're upset about President Trump trying to decrease murders in the District of Columbia. But the other important thing to look at here is, as with every Democrat you see, follow the money. Who's behind this? A new report from the New York Post highlights that George Soros is heavily involved in funding these protests. Left-wing dark money megadonors, including George Soros, contribute $20 million to groups funding protests against Trump's DC crime crackdown. Now, understanding the history here, George Soros has funded the campaigns of the progressive prosecutors, the group of prosecutors who were elected to stop enforcing crime laws in big cities around the country. Some of the progressive prosecutors have been in cities like San Francisco, California, where they stopped enforcing crime and stopped enforcing criminal laws and saw just their cities turn to absolute hellholes. That has happened here, and now it's notable that George Soros is simultaneously funding protests and efforts to fight against cracking down on crime. It's ironic that a protest to ostensibly free DC was hosted by Community Change, a group funded by massive amounts of outside dark money to push a pro-crime agenda. Caitlin Sutherland, the executive director of nonprofit watchdog Americans for Public Trust, said in a statement, DC is facing shootings, carjackings, and assaults, and yet progressive groups like the Pritzker Foundation, George Soros, and the Arabella Network all spend millions of dollars to manufacture protests that weaken our communities, Sutherland added. In addition to funding from George Soros, Arabella advisors, and others identified by Americans for Public Trust, these protests are also being bolstered by rent-a-protest companies. DC paid protester requests surged 400% amid Trump's federal takeover of city police. So these are being organized by an organization called Crowds on Demand. So the astroturfing has gone from groups funding and organizing to literally being able to pay for a protest to pop up. And that's a lot of what we're seeing right now in Washington, D.C. Another organization involved in these protests is a group called Refuse Fascism. But as you look at who's behind Refuse Fascism, it's the Revolutionary Communist Party. So to quote Stefan from Saturday Night Live, these protests have it all. You've got your paid astroturf groups. You've got George Soros, Arabella advisors, and even the Pritzker Foundation. And now you've also got the Revolutionary Communist Party. Congratulations to the left for continuing to put a good face on every political fight they have. One figure who's not getting enough attention in this fight over DC crime is DC Attorney General Brian Schwalb. Yes, the District of Columbia does have an attorney general, and one of his primary responsibilities is overseeing juvenile crime. Here is him facing an angry town hall of people who are asking why juveniles are not being held accountable.
We as a city and a community need to be much more focused on prevention and surrounding young people and their families with resources if we want to be safer in the long run. We cannot prosecute and arrest our way out of it.
If you're wondering what Brian Schwalb is doing instead of his job of trying to reduce juvenile crime, a lot of it has to do with building his own political future with lawsuits against organizations like the National Rifle Association. But again, not every activist is as concerned about crime as you would expect.
When I go to DC, I'm not afraid of losing my wallet so much as I'm afraid of losing my vote. I'm not afraid of losing my wallet so much as I'm afraid that my children's freedom to breathe will be stolen in a world where climate change policy is non-existent.
This is one of the left's biggest problems. They're trying to explain away danger that people are feeling in their lives by pointing to things like statistics or pointing to other political priorities like climate change. Here is our friend Kristen Soltis Anderson talking about this dynamic.
Isn't this the exact same problem that Democrats had last year? Look at the statistics. We promise you the economy is great, while people are going, it doesn't feel great to me.
We've followed the saga of the fleeing Texas Democrats who fled their state of Texas to protest redistricting to Illinois, the home of the spaghetti and meatballs congressional map. They have announced plans to return home. The special session that they were fleeing and hiding from is supposed to end this weekend. What Texas Governor Greg Abbott has announced is that he will continue to call for special session after special session until all of this gets voted through. So what's going to happen is the Texas Democrats will return home, the congressional maps will pass without much issue, and Texas Democrats' stunt will have been for nothing except for to highlight just how absurd Democrats' hypocrisy on this issue has been. One more time with J.B. Pritzker.
I do want to look at the map of Illinois. Let's take a look at this. Despite President Trump winning 44% of the statewide vote in 2024, Republicans hold only 3 of Illinois' 17 districts. These districts seem to be designed to maximize Democratic advantage. What do you say to those who argue that it's hypocritical for you to criticize Texas for partisanship when your state also drew maps to boost your party's standing?
As Democrats attempt to set up both the 2026 midterms and 2028 presidential election and find who their next standard bearer is going to be, we've seen a lot of trial runs from people like J.B. Pritzker, Gavin Newsom. One person who has been out there a little bit more is Mayor Pete, the former failed transportation secretary from the Biden administration and former mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He made a lot of headlines this week when he did an interview with Pod Save America and was asked very specifically about the situation in Gaza.
Do you think it's time to recognize a Palestinian state?
I think that's a profound question that arouses a lot of the biggest problems that have happened with Israel's survival, Israel's right to survival.
If that type of non-structured answer sounds familiar, it's because it's very similar to Kamala Harris and her famous word salads. Mayor Pete's answer was not received well. Here is Ben Rhodes. Pete is a smart guy, and I admire a lot of what he's done, but I have absolutely no idea what he thinks based on these answers. Just tell us what you believe. Now, important context, Ben Rhodes, as an Obama advisor, had the nickname Hamas because of how much he hated Israel. So it's not surprising that he would not be satisfied with the answer here. But here's another reaction. This is Peter Savodnik of the Free Press. The right answer is, of course not. You don't reward terrorists. That would be idiotic, and it would hurt the Palestinians irreparably. But that would require a spine and a vision and an authenticity that the professional rules followers are generally incapable of. Those are two ends of the spectrum of the reaction to Mayor Pete's answer, but the left overwhelmingly opposed the word salad that he gave and his inability to be unequivocal on how he feels about the situation in Gaza. We will continue to watch this soft presidential launch go, but so far it's off to a pretty rough start for Mayor Pete. And who could have predicted this? Probably Joe Biden. Here's what he had to say about him.
Joe Biden helped lead the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which gave healthcare to 20 million people. And when parkgoers called on Pete Buttigieg, he installed decorative lights under bridges, giving citizens of South Bend colorfully illuminated rivers.
On Tuesday, we talked about polling that showed that the elites in America, people that make over $150,000, have postgraduate degrees and live in big cities, view politics very differently than normal Americans. One of the issues that the elites felt strongly about was measures they were willing to take to fight climate change. And one of those measures they considered was banning private air conditioning. Our polling found that a majority of elites in America were willing to ban private air conditioning if it might help the fight against climate change. Air conditioning has become an inflection point in France in their presidential election. Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader in France, declared that she would deploy a major air conditioning equipment plan around the country if her nationalist party eventually came to power. Marine Tondelier, the head of France's Green Party, scoffed at Ms. Le Pen's idea and instead suggested solutions to warming temperatures that included greening cities and making buildings more energy efficient. An opinion essay in Le Figaro, a conservative newspaper, defended air conditioning because making our fellow citizens sweat limits learning, reduces working hours, and clogs up hospitals. Libération, a left-wing daily, countered such arguments, writing that the technology was an environmental aberration that must be overcome because it blows hot air into streets and guzzles up precious energy. Is air conditioning a far-right thing? One talk show asked provocatively, reflecting how divisive the issue has become. So if you're in a political fight and you get to be the side that supports air conditioning, particularly in a climate where people are getting hospitalized due to heat exhaustion, you're in a pretty good place. But this is very similar to the debate forming in the United States. For the last 4 years, President Biden was willing to entertain all sorts of bans and restrictions on our daily comforts in an effort to have a minimal, negligible impact on warming temperatures and the climate. In many cases, no impact at all. We will see how this plays out in France because it likely will continue to shape our politics here in America. But as for myself, I am very excited to be on the pro-air conditioning side of the political aisle. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on 10 Minute Drill. Please subscribe, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Tell your friends. Thanks so much. Have a good day.